Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, which was named by Poets and Writers a best book for writers. Every week, I speak with novelists, with authors, with writers of every niche to talk about their tips, their tricks, their strategies, and how the sauce is made, including creative advice. I'll talk about essays and articles and share my own experience from 3 decades of publishing. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. And follow along on Substack, where I share special clips for subscribers only at estelleserasmus.substack.com. Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, and today I am so happy to have Casey Mulligan Walsh with us, and she is the author of the memoir, The Full Catastrophe, All I Ever Wanted, Everything I Feared. Welcome, Casey.
Oh, thank you so much, Estelle. I'm delighted to be here. I feel like I've known you for a long while, even though we're just meeting today.
And I love hearing that because, part of why I do Freelance Writing Direct is to kind of be there, like they get me, the audience
Yes.
gets me in a way that my students do. So I love hearing that from you. So thank you. I want to preface this by saying I've had a difficult time throughout my career dealing with issues of grief because I haven't had a lot of it in my life, luckily. And so
Mhm.
this comes at a really important time because I lost my father, my beloved father, recently. And it kind of made me more open to talking about, even though I had you scheduled, to talking about grief and to looking at it in a different way with a different lens. So I just wanted to preface that. And, I think your book and us talking about it for me on the podcast comes at this very pivotal time that I'm dealing with
Mhm.
my own grief for my dad.
I'm so happy to hear that. I mean, not about your dad, of course. I'm so sorry about that.
Thank you.
But I'm happy to hear that the book was something that maybe gave you a little bit of a different perspective under the umbrella, of course, of the fact that we all grieve differently and there's no right or wrong way, right? But hopefully there's some permission in the book for that too, to grieve in the way that's right for you. And you're not the first person. There's actually a few people, couple of people maybe, that I've either have written reviews or I've done interviews with that just before it happened, they had a significant loss. And I know somehow you think that maybe that's not a coincidence. I don't know, but I'm really happy to be able to offer something of help during such a difficult time.
It's interesting. When I first read it, I kind of wanted to skim. I'm just being honest. I wanted to
Yeah.
skim past the difficult parts. I was like, oh God, here it comes.
Good.
And when I
Okay.
looked at it again, shortly before we started speaking today, I really kind of delved into the difficult passages. So just wanted to share that with you.
Good, good. I have heard people say too, a good friend, I was talking to a dear friend yesterday, a friend of my son, Eric's actually, who said she read to a certain point, she knew what was coming, she just had to put it down. But then again, they had a recent very tragic loss among their friends, the death of a young child. And now she's like really anxious to go back to it. So I think you read it when it's right for you.
Yes, I agree. And so, for the viewers and listeners who don't know what your book is about, do you want to give a little snapshot of what it's about?
Sure, sure. So the full catastrophe is really my story of the search for belonging after repeated loss, navigating uncertainty, and learning to live with grief beside joy. The story is that, I was orphaned at 12, and then my only sibling died when I was 20. And that set me off on a search for belonging that became the goal that rose above every other goal I had in life. I just, I needed to create a family so I'd never be alone. So I did create that family I dreamed of. I had 3 children, but my marriage was not what the dream I had envisioned. And when it began to crumble, I embraced a new spirituality, just a new way to see the world that became a lifeline for me during a very hostile and conflicted divorce. But then the unthinkable happened. My oldest son, Eric, died at 20. And of course, that was a devastating loss. But the spiritual strength I'd cultivated helped me navigate my grief and really led me to a deeper sense of belonging. And so I like to say that it's really about embracing the full catastrophe of life, right? In all its messy, beautiful complexity. And really, I think this book illustrates how early losses that happen before we reach adulthood, can dictate the decisions we make really for the rest of our lives, unless we find a way to kind of look at it differently.
Yeah, so you've had so much loss. And for me, like I look at themes in books. And I
Mm.
know you've spoken about this before in interviews, but there is a theme of belonging and finding your
Mhm.
place. And when you look at the way the book is broken down, actually, you start with Still. We'll get back to Still. That's a flash fiction that you had done for Split Lips. And then you go into the prologue, which is kind of discussing that moment, with Eric, losing
Mhm.
Eric. And then you go back into like your childhood. And the theme that runs throughout in terms of belonging is what you did to try to belong after all these losses, to contort yourself, whether it's as a child or after losing your parents, like going towards the Catholic religion when you were, your
Mhm.
dad had been a lapsed Catholic, doing things to fit in, and with your marriage. And there's a section that you talk about that you were water skiing. And I would just love to read that little part.
Sure.
So it's on page 44, and I'm going to start here. Many weekends, Will, his sister, and her boyfriend water ski. They make it look effortless. Characteristically curious, I wouldn't typically clamor for a turn. Since September, I've become one of the Simonson family, but now I need to be part of lake life too. Maybe it'll be fun once I learn, I think, as I wade into the water, awkwardly forcing my feet into the skis that refuse to cooperate. Over and over, Will backs the boat into position and tosses the rope to me, reminds me to keep my knees a little bent, like a shock absorber, he likes to say, shouts ready and guns the engine. Over and over, I jerk forward, let go, and watch the rope handle bounce away across the surface of the lake. Late in the afternoon, everything finally clicks. Suddenly up, I ski around the lake and cruise back to the dock just in time for dinner on the screen porch of the camp on the hill. Never again do I struggle to get up on skis. Often, I'll prefer to lounge in a chair by the water with a book or visit with friends. Instead, around the lake I'll go, a huge smile masking some serious self-talk. This is fun, I convince myself. I'm so lucky to have this boat and this spectacular lake. Some days I actually do enjoy skimming over the water on skis. Some days I almost believe this sun-kissed, risk-taking girl is who I really am. Maybe Will and his friends are uncovering a piece of me I didn't know existed. Or maybe I'm twisting myself to fit neatly into the space they've made for me. I have no idea how to tell the difference. And that is using scene to elaborate on a theme that runs throughout the book. So I want to backtrack and ask you, how did you decide on the theme that runs through? And what made you decide what to include? Because there's so much in a life, in a childhood, in a marriage, motherhood. How did you pick these pieces out?
Yes. So that's a very big question, right? The answer to how I chose the theme is kind of interesting. And I think the theme chose me. I didn't, think through a series of themes and select one. So I started writing in 2012. I started writing essays or 2011. And I started in a little local course with Marion Roach Smith, who many people know, and she was local to my area. And so for a long while, I wrote essays. For about 6 years, I wrote essays, still never really realizing I could try to get them published. I just wrote essays, lots of them. A group of us got together after that course and met every 2 weeks. And so every 2 weeks, I cranked out an essay. And in 2017, I'd had enough feedback. And, I've had a pretty unusual life. And I came to the point in May of 2017 where I sketched out like the outline of what a book might look like. And basically started by taking what I thought was the best writing from all the essays and kind of plugging them in places. And of course, the book that I ended up with is vastly different from that. But from 2017 for like 5 years, I finessed and wrote drafts and had multiple drafts and really felt like I had the final draft. And I sent the book to an editor who I really respected, who talks a lot about trauma and writing through trauma. And she did a beautiful job. But in the middle of her having it, I was taking yet another workshop. I don't know what workshop it was. And they were talking about themes. And it just hit me over the head that the book was really not about relentless resilience after repeated loss. I mean, it's kind of about that, but that's what I thought the whole point of the book was. And it was like the heavens opened up and the light came on. And it's like this whole book is about the search for belonging after repeated loss. And I think that's maybe not as unusual as it sounds that it happens that way, because I think the more that you write and the more that you finesse scenes and discuss things with critique partners, the more things become apparent to you. And I sometimes wonder if I ever would have really identified that strong theme in my life if I hadn't been writing. So that's one way that writing, I think, really, I've used this phrase a lot lately, and it's not a phrase I usually use, but you kind of reverse engineer the story of your life as you're writing. You get to the end. It's like when you write an essay, right? Sometimes you get about 2/3 of the way through and you're like, oh, that's what this is really about. And then you go back and you work in the thread. So that's the answer to the part about the theme. And then many brilliant writing teachers, you included, I'm sure, will talk about once you have your theme, then you really go back and, with a light hand, steer everything toward that theme. So, for example, the prologue, which is it's a scene about 6 weeks after Eric died, where I'm getting calls for check collection for a bad check he'd written like 9 months before. That was an essay that had been published in Modern Loss. A part of that was. But I reworked that as the prologue and made sure that where it goes to at the end is a place that sets the reader up for the book to be about belonging. So the reader, knows from the first entry into chapter 1 that this is kind of what they're listening for. But when it comes to scene, another thing, so Lisa Cooper Ellison is the person who did that
Lisa,
edit for me.
wonderful.
Love Lisa.
Love Lisa.
And she just did this beautiful job. It wasn't really a developmental edit, right? Because the book was fairly done, but she pushed me that next level deeper that I think the book would not, I know the book would not have been what it is without that. And one of the things she said is it's, beautifully written, beautiful writing, but too much exposition, not enough scene. It's not like the whole book was exposition, right? There was scene, but I could see more clearly then how me telling you this could be this just one scene that illustrates the whole thing. So I kind of went in and did that over and over. I did a little of that poetic license we take where maybe 3 scenes happened like on a Friday night and a Saturday morning and a Saturday night, but they really didn't happen in that time frame. But it makes the reading more propulsive, a little more like reading a novel. And I'm really thrilled that you decided to read that water skiing scene, because that's something I added way toward the end. And I don't even know that my critique partners thought it was that essential, but that kind of goes to that advice to like listen to everyone, but then trust yourself. because it
Yeah.
just felt like a really important theme to me.
Yes,
And
it's
it,
that twisting yourself to
yeah,
contort. And
yeah,
that went throughout the book, even during this
yeah,
contentious divorce, and you were feeling angry and you were trying to get your kids to like you, and just you kept putting your own
right,
self aside because you have
right,
from that early insecurity of not belonging and trying to twist yourself until you made a decision at a certain point. I think after your son died, a
mhm,
while after your son died, and then I think when you met your current husband,
mhm,
Kevin, who you've been
mhm.
married for a long time,
Yes, yes,
that really gave, like you say in the book, you found your sense of home. But I don't think you would have
right,
been able to find it in him if you hadn't found
right.
it in yourself first.
Exactly. And one of the things that was very hard for me, we all toil through that your log line or your query letter, all the ways that you summarize your book and talk about your themes. And back when we used to on Twitter do that, what was that, pitch wars or whatever, where you put in your 280 character. I finally nailed the book description when I realized that or knew that this was what was wrong, that people expect a book about a death, and of course, lots of deaths in my book, but let's say the death of my child, which really doesn't happen until about 3/4 of the way through the book. And then the rest of the book is about how you got through your grief and what you learned. And this is not that book. It's an unexpected version of a book about loss for many reasons, but more because it's really about me, not about Eric, and it's about the search for belonging, but also all of the shift in my thinking and the way that I saw the world happened in that year and a half leading up to Eric's death. It wasn't a result of Eric's death. And so
Ah,
this is almost the biggest reason why I felt compelled to write this book, which is that for a year and a half to 2 years before Eric died, I mean, it was the dark night of the soul. Everything I'd fought to build was falling apart, and my kids were all struggling. And of course, when you're a struggling child, who do you act out against? The safe parent. And
yeah.
so all of those things were happening. And during that time, I think it's not surprising that that was during that time that I kind of embraced this new way to see the world, because that's often when you get to the place where you've done what you've done for so many years, and you're either going to find another way or you're not going to make it. That is the dark night of the soul, right? When Eric died, I had a friend who was going through a lot of the same things, and we were exploring the same kind of, I always call it just a little tongue in cheek, like Buddhist Christianity. It was just a more expansive view of our connection to each other and our connection to a higher power and all of that. The day that Eric died, she was there with me, and we were just like, couldn't even speak because all of the things that we had been saying and internalizing and really making part of who we were exactly the things I needed that day. And so in the days very quickly after Eric died, I had a lot of peace. And this is my line, peace does not preclude sorrow. And as I'm sure you understand with your dad, right? You can have peace about something, but you still grieve and you still have sorrow.
I want to talk a little bit about the structure. So you broke it up into several parts.
I just put the story I already had into Jessica Brody's Save the Cat Writes a Novel.
Yes.
And I was so thrilled to see, A, my story really did fit into those 15
Was
beats.
it the hero's journey? Was that
Um,
yours? Or was it
well,
the coming of age, which a combination?
Probably I'd have to go back and look at the book. I wish I had that at the tip of my tongue, but it is similar to a hero's journey, I
Yes.
realize, where you set off on this search, even to the point that someone in a hero's journey, usually someone gives you the answer early on, but you don't listen and you have to find it on your own. And in my story, my mom's friend Elle, who I was so, so close to, really gave me the answer when I was like 16. But you can't just, hear a line and then your life is fixed, right? Like you have to go out and live your life and experience it and learn it. But also, there's in the hero's journey, there's usually that false victory where you think you got what you wanted. And I really thought I had created this life, that I dreamed of. I worked with Joyce Maynard once years and years ago, and she characterized my book as a story about building a family out of the ashes of the one I'd lost, only to watch it crumble, which is a
Oh,
way of,
wow.
looking at it. My husband, so we've been married 22 years. He was a social worker in his career. He's just a great guy. He's listened to every single thing I've ever written. And he's not a writer, but he's a big picture guy. So often, like, I'll read him this whole thing and he'll just have one line that's like, that's exactly it. And so I laughingly said, this is not a book where I like meet a guy and he saves me. And what he'll say is, you were always who you were. Our lives together just created the condition that you needed, which is a wonderful
To
way of
bloom,
looking at
to
it. And
flourish.
it's
Yes.
a wonderful way of looking at it for any good relationship, because I think in our feminism and independence and all that, like, I don't need anybody, whether it's a man or a woman, but a good relationship can create conditions so you can be stronger in who you are. And that's not someone saving you. It's a different
Absolutely.
thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. I love that. So there are certain parts when you're talking about Eric, like you're using some dreams to kind of access feelings that you were dealing with. And I thought that was clever, using dreams to create scene through
Mhm.
dreams, in effect, that then shows clues to the character, to your character, or to the
Yeah.
characters that you're dealing with. I think you use like some phone calls. So did you actually access the phone call and then write it down, what it actually was?
Well, so that call was actually with my younger son, Kyle, who obviously all of the kids suffered. What each of them was experiencing affected the other. And so I was never really sure which Kyle I was going to get on any particular day. The scene that I wrote in the book happened exactly the way that I wrote it. And luckily, that was back when there were little tapes and answering machines. So I saved that tape all these years. And when I was writing essays now, I'm thinking it was probably like in 2015, probably 10 years ago, I transcribed the tape, luckily, because who has a tape player anymore? And that's a little bit condensed version of the call. But I'm so, so grateful that I had that, because I don't think there would be anything that I could have written that could have characterized him better than those phone calls. I could say sometimes he could be sarcastic and funny, and then another day he'd be hostile, but that would not have anywhere near the same impact, I think, as reading that series of voicemails that was really just hysterical and so indicative of his sense of humor even now.
And how did you decide to use dreams, like particularly when it came to Eric and the dream about his
Yes,
teeth and things like that?
yes. So again, I mean, sometimes we do things that seem like such brilliant decisions, but actually it's just that I truly had that dream. And it was about a year. He died in June of 99. And about a year later, I was talking to a friend and we were talking about a book that was popular back then. Maybe it was Embracing the Light or something. It was about, seeing God after you die. And we were just like theoretically saying, oh, I don't know. Do you really remember your dreams that clearly? And it suddenly hit me that in the journal on the table over there, I had written about this dream that I had had. And so I pulled it out. And I'm not really a journaler either, but when I had this dream, it was almost exactly 5 months to the day before Eric died, but he was struggling. And I woke up wide awake, like at 3 in the morning, and thought, I have to write every word of this down. It was like a vision. Some dreams are more like a visit or a
Yeah.
vision than a dream. And I wrote all of this down and forgot all about it. And when I found it a year and a half later, my jaw was just, dropped, because it was such incredible symbolism for what had actually happened. It was amazing.
And it's
Um,
great to use that because it ties in with like the spiritual and using
yes,
other senses and other forms of
right,
communication rather than just everything in scene or just like you said before, exposition. This is how I felt. This is
right,
what I think. So you
right.
learn a lot. And I did notice that, there is also a literary bent to, and that makes sense because you have that literary background. And we're going to also segue into your literary project that you're involved with now as well. But
Yes.
I wanted to still talk about this a little bit more. The themes we talked about, and we talked about, kind of using a lot of scenes. Like I definitely did like that, because with scene, then you can use language and metaphor and all sorts of interesting ways of explaining things. I love at the end that you talk about, I'll just read a tiny little part at the end. It says from 301, some people hold tightly to their story. When my story was all I had, I did that too. I've had a life filled with tragedy. I'll probably die young, but I decided long ago that this is not what I want for myself. I decided to believe that my past is not my future, even when the present held no promise of better things to come, even when relationships I had were not the sort I feared losing, even when they were the sort I feared would last. I learned to hold things lightly, and better things came in spades. So that's really interesting, because that is the spiritual philosophy that you espouse. It's a part of you, it's how you view.
Mhm.
And you had to come to that from this place
Mhm.
of not belonging, twisting yourself, trying to find ways to fit in, dealing with bullying from childhood, dealing with abuse
Mhm.
in a marriage, dealing with, the turmoil of kids who were dealing with a
Mhm.
difficult co-parenting situation,
Yes.
the
Yes.
financial instability and all that. And you came out on the other side. And I actually like that you include that part of coming out on the other side. Not all books do. Some just like
Mhm.
end in the maelstrom, and you showed
Mhm.
the other side, which I think is important. And it helps the reader, because there is a way out and up, and like you said, the full
Mhm.
catastrophe, and that can
Right.
happen in life. So I think that's really part of it. And I want to do a little segueing into your literary work, right? Because you had a piece, Still, which is in the beginning of the book, and that
Oh,
garnered you awards, right? Was it the whole
yeah.
piece, or is it a part of the piece?
No, that I'm so glad you said that because it's really only the first half of the piece.
Okay.
There's no way I could have put the whole piece in the beginning because it would have been the whole story. I was really compelled to put that up front, but I had to think a lot about how I would include it, how much I would include. For a while, it was the beginning of the prologue, but just before, I sent in the final manuscript, I thought, this could just be on a page by itself, almost like an epigraph. And so that's what we did. It's before the body of the book, it's before the table of contents, I think, but it's only the first half. So if folks want to read the whole thing, they'd have to go to Split Lip magazine and look for
And
that.
with the prologue, it's not the moment that you found out about Eric, it's like
No,
after. So it's like
it's
the aftermath. You're dealing with it, you're talking about it, but it's not that moment. That's later on in the
right,
book. But you
right.
use that as the epilogue before you went into the childhood. And I think that's an interesting choice. Did you do it because you wanted to show that you were dealing with grief, that you were dealing with a catastrophe from the beginning and then going back? Like, what was your decision on that?
Well, I think the bigger decision was that obviously came to fruition in the prologue is that the reader begins knowing that Eric has died. And, it's not a mystery, it's not a novel. You're going to know that on the back cover copy. And that was not, especially when I realized that was not the point of the book. The point of the book was the search for belonging. I thought it was almost kinder to the reader to know this from the beginning. And then the thing you always question, as a writer is, well, is this giving, why do they want to read on? Like, is this giving everything away? But what I had beta readers and critiquers say over and over again is that no, we're really compelled to read because we want to know what happened. Like, I don't tell you how he died or the lead up. You just know. Here's another reason I liked that piece at the beginning is I don't consider myself somebody who writes with a lot of humor. I think there's humor in my book. There's a lot of dark humor because that's how I survived. It sounds strange if you haven't read the book, but there's some levity in this prologue. Another thing it illustrates in scene, rather than me telling you this, is that I had been so, I hate that when people think right after someone dies like that, that you're in shock. Maybe a lot of people are in shock. I wasn't in shock. I was so present. And so I think people were shocked at how, for lack of a better word, was kind of zen through that whole period of time. And for some reason, this was the hill I chose to die on. They wanted me to send a guest certificate. I was not going to do it. And then I realized, I mean, I'd written that scene years before, but then I realized that that so illustrated how much I'd had to prove myself my entire life. And finally, I didn't have to prove anything to anyone. And of course, these calls were repeated. They came the whole summer. And I did end up with a lot of kind of flip and snarky responses, not trying to be rude to the poor person on the phone, but, just at one point I say, you're going to have a hard time reaching him.
Right.
Like
Right.
it did make me realize that the scene that I had written for a whole different purpose had the potential to illustrate a lot about my life leading up to that. And that's why I put it there.
Interesting. And then you end that section with, though I couldn't rewrite my own history, I'd been certain I could protect my kids from the same ache by putting down deep roots in a small village. Yet even this didn't save them from the pain and struggle I'd have given anything to prevent. Maybe it's genetic, that elusive sense of being entitled to a place in the world. Maybe some, the lucky ones, inherit the secret code and pass it down to their children. I wondered how that would be for far too many years, waking up in the world like you already knew you belonged there. So that's a very strategic way of ending it,
Yes,
because now you're getting into your background, into your childhood
yes,
and the search for
yes.
belonging. And so how did you decide on that last line? Like, was that part of the original essay or did you?
No, no. So the original essay was just all of the phone calls. So I trimmed that a little bit, but that was, it was kind of like I won the battle, but now I realize I've lost the war, like kind of a pat little ending. The first attempt at making that the prologue ended with, and this is a really good illustration, I think, of the arc of what we go through as we write, because it ended with a line I use much later in the book now about how from the moment your children are born, you're learning to let them go. But probably it was Lisa who pointed out to me that then that sets the reader up for a whole story about letting your children go. And so, once I learned that aspect, that the prologue is supposed to hook the reader and, orient them to the characters, but also set up the essential question for the book. And that wasn't doing it. And so sometimes you get a comment like that, and then you don't really need a lot more else because now it's clear and you know what you need to get in there. The next question was, where do I start? One of the biggest fears for memoirists is that it looks like we're writing an autobiography. It should be this defined period of time. But for me, if the story is about the search for belonging, it does start when I'm small. The decision I made was to start at like the kickoff, they would say, for the whole book is the death of my mother, and I was 12. And so I
Yeah,
do work in some of my earlier life and about my father and his death in small flashbacks, but I
yeah,
had written it all chronologically, so the way I had first written it, it was like I was 5. You cannot go all the way back there, but I think 12 was that was what ended my life with my family and thrust me into this other
yeah.
world.
How did
Mhm.
you decide on the title, The Full Catastrophe?
Way early on, I had heard that phrase. Actually, I'm a big singer-songwriter fan, and there's a duo now. They used to be a group that live over in the Pioneer Valley in New Hampshire or in Massachusetts called the Neils, and they had a song with the title "The Full Catastrophe," and it intrigued me. So I kind of dug into it and realized it was a quote from Zorba the Greek. And in the book, I think it's longer, but in the movie, basically the boss asks him, "Are you married?" And he's like, "Am I not a man? Of course I'm married. I have it all, the full catastrophe, like the wife, the car, the kids." But John Kabat-Zinn wrote a book about mindfulness called Full Catastrophe Living, and he characterizes it as the poignant enormity of our life experience. And it's basically that I had lost everything and I wanted the full catastrophe. I wanted the dirty diapers and the bills and the sports practices and the joys and the struggles. I wanted it all. And then I got kind of the literal catastrophe. And so the double meaning of the title, I can't even imagine the book with any other title. The subtitle is What Was a Struggle? Oh my gosh, lists and lists of a memoir of this and a memoir of that. But one day it hit me like there's this double meaning. I want the double meaning to be obvious. And so it is that the full catastrophe is all I ever wanted. And it also was everything I feared.
Wow. I love that. And you published with Motina Press, and
I
Diane
did.
been on
Yes,
the program. And how was
yes.
that experience publishing with a small press?
It's been just wonderful. And, I have lots of friends who've published with different sorts of publishers, and some have great experiences, some have nightmarish experiences, no communication, no answers. And, Motina is one woman, it's Diane Windsor, but she is team author all the way, never doesn't, I mean, if she doesn't answer an email in a day, something's really wrong. And she's just really just been wonderful to work with.
You're involved with In a Flash, which is a literary publication on Substack. Can you just
Mhm.
talk a little bit about that?
I'd be happy to. So, a group of six of us originally got together 2022, I think, or 2023, something to do with Hippocamp, which we all, we used to love to go to and isn't running anymore. But we all wanted to work. It was probably 22 because that's when Still came out. And I also had a tiny love story and a couple of other micro flash pieces. So I was really enamored with Flash, and somebody came on and said, does anybody want to just form a critique group for Flash? So that ran for a little while. One of the people stayed with us a good long time but had other directions she wanted to go, and so there ended up being five of us. And somewhere in there, Nina Lichtenstein had the idea that we should start a literary magazine. Like, oh, why not? And then we just spent a lot of time really on the back end, assigning roles, defining roles, deciding what it would look like. And the thing that sets us apart is that we take subs on a theme from the 1st to the 15th of the month, and the themes are all announced far in advance. It's 500 words or less. And each of us is the lead editor twice a year. And we select one piece, like the piece that shines for us. And that writer is featured. They're the only person that is featured in that issue. So they get a lot of press. There's a Q&A, there's a beautiful bio. Each of the editors, the lead editor writes an intro, but each of the editors also writes why they loved the piece. And so we feel really great about it because the people we've chosen so far, some of the subs are from brand new writers, some are very accomplished writers.
That's great. And do you pay?
There's no charge for subs, but there's a $25 honorarium.
Casey, this has been great. It's been such a pleasure talking to you about your book, The Full Catastrophe, and all the wonderful literary community work that you're doing to be a supportive and contributing member of the community. If you're dealing with grief, or if you're looking at life and about to deal with things, even aging parents, people in your lives who have chronic illnesses, I think it's really helpful to see a book that unabashedly deals with these kind of subjects because that's part of the circle of life.
It certainly is. Thank you so much for having me. You're a wonderful interviewer, Estelle. I love to listen to your podcast, and now I'm thrilled to be part of it.
Thank you so much, Casey. I appreciate that. Follow me at estelleserasmus.com on my website and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.